The artillery opens before dawn on November 19, 1942, and the sound carries across the frozen steppe for miles in every direction. It is not German guns. Along the northern shoulder of the Stalingrad salient, Soviet batteries fire a preparation lasting 80 minutes. Over 3,000 guns aimed at a front held not by German divisions but by the Romanian Third Army, thinly stretched across terrain that offers almost no natural defense. The ground is frozen solid. The temperature has already fallen well below zero, and the men holding that line have neither the anti-tank reserves nor the operational depth to absorb what is coming. What comes is Operation Uranus. Soviet planners have been working toward this moment since September. General Georgy Zhukov and Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky presented the concept to Stalin in late October. Two armored thrusts, north and south of Stalingrad, aimed not at the city itself but at the flanks that sustain it. The plan is methodical, patient, and deliberately concealed. Soviet forces move at night. Supply columns avoid the main roads. The Germans read signals of an offensive building somewhere along the front, but the scale and the timing remain hidden long enough to matter. On the German side, the man most responsible for the forces around Stalingrad is General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army. He is 52 years old, a staff officer by formation and temperament, precise and methodical in his thinking, loyal to command hierarchy in a way that would prove catastrophic in the weeks ahead. He has spent most of 1942 driving his army forward, through the summer heat, across the Don, into the shattered city itself. He does not dismiss the threat to his flanks. He reports it, but his superiors, including Hitler, assess the Romanians as sufficient and the Soviets as too weakened by months of urban combat to mount an encirclement of serious depth. That assessment begins failing within hours of the first Soviet advance. The Romanian Third Army collapses rapidly under armored pressure it cannot stop. Soviet tank columns push through the gaps, bypassing pockets of resistance, driving south and southeast. Paulus requests freedom of maneuver, permission to pull forces from the city and respond to the threat on his flank. The request is denied. Army Group B headquarters believes the breakthrough can be contained. The logic is familiar. German forces have stabilized crises before. On November 20th, the southern pincer opens. Soviet forces strike the Romanian Fourth Army below Stalingrad, and the results are nearly identical. Within a day, two armored columns are driving toward each other across open steppe, moving faster than the German command system can process what they represent. The junction comes on November 23rd at Kalash-on-Don, a small town on the western bank of the Don River. Soviet forces from north and south link up and close the ring. Approximately 290,000 to 300,000 German and Axis soldiers, the core of the Sixth Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army, are now inside a pocket roughly 50 miles wide and 30 miles deep. At German headquarters, early assessments described the encirclement as incomplete. The ring is thin in places. It has formed quickly. The Soviets, some officers argue, have outrun their supply lines. A counterattack at the right point could reopen a corridor within days. These arguments are not irrational given what prior German operations have achieved. Since 1941, the Wehrmacht has broken encirclements, stabilized fronts that appeared lost, and recovered from reverses that seemed decisive. The pattern of success shapes the reading of the new situation. But the Stalingrad pocket is not a temporary penetration. It is a fully formed encirclement, anchored by rivers and defended by Soviet forces prepared to hold it. And the Sixth Army, already stretched by months of brutal urban combat and undersupplied going into winter, is now entirely dependent on a perimeter it did not choose and a relief operation that does not yet exist. The circle is closed. Whether those inside fully understand that is another matter. The order reaches Paulus on November 24th, one day after the ring closes. Hitler's directive is unambiguous. The Sixth Army will hold its current positions, form a defensive perimeter, a Festung, a fortress, and wait for relief. There will be no breakout attempt. There will be no withdrawal toward the west. The army that has fought its way to the Volga will remain where it stands until outside forces reopen the corridor. The logic behind the order is not simply stubbornness. It carries a strategic rationale that, given the information available to Hitler's headquarters, is not without internal coherence. A breakout attempt by an army already low on fuel and ammunition, moving across open frozen steppe in winter, against Soviet forces now controlling the surrounding terrain, carries serious risks of its own. Withdrawal movements under pressure had destroyed German formations before, and holding the Stalingrad position, Hitler argues, pins down Soviet forces and preserves a forward anchor from which a spring offensive might still be possible. The fortress concept had worked at other points along the Eastern Front. It is not an obviously wrong idea in November 1942. It is, however, entirely dependent on one condition, that the army inside the pocket can be supplied from the air. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring assures Hitler that the Luftwaffe can deliver what the Sixth Army needs. The promise is made quickly, without detailed logistical analysis. Göring's staff does not rigorously calculate the tonnage required against available aircraft, range, weather conditions, or the state of the airfields. The number most often cited at the time is 300 tons per day as a minimum, already an optimistic reduction from the Army's actual requirement of closer to 700 tons. Even 300 tons is beyond what the available transport fleet can realistically deliver over the distances and in the conditions of a Russian winter. Paulus knows the arithmetic does not hold. His quartermasters calculate the Army's minimum survival requirement at approximately 500 to 700 tons daily, covering food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. He transmits this figure to Army Group headquarters. The response does not revise the airlift commitment. The relief operation, it is communicated, will reach the pocket before the supply situation becomes critical. What Paulus does not do is refuse the order. He is not a man who breaks from the chain of command under ambiguity. His career has been built on staff precision and institutional loyalty. Some of his senior officers, most notably General Arthur Schmidt, his chief of staff, actively reinforce the fortress concept, believing the army can hold and that relief will arrive. Others, including several corps commanders, believe a breakout attempt in late November, while the army still retains fuel and some mobility, represents the only realistic path to survival. Those arguments are made. They do not prevail. The relief operation takes shape under General Hermann Hoth. His 4th Panzer Army pushes northeast from Kotelnikovo beginning December 12th, driving across frozen ground toward the southern perimeter of the pocket. The operation is called Wintergewitter, winter storm. In its opening days it moves faster than Soviet commanders expect. Hoth's forward elements cross the Aksay River, then push toward the Mishkova. By December 19th, they are approximately 48 kilometers from the southern edge of the Stalingrad perimeter. Inside the pocket, men can hear the distant rumble of artillery. The knowledge that relief forces are close enough to be heard sharpens the endurance of soldiers already weakened by cold and reduced rations. Paulus is advised that a breakout southward, designated Operation Thunderclap, could be attempted in coordination with Hoth's advance. It would require fuel the army barely possesses, and Hitler has not authorized it. Paulus does not move. Hoth's advance stalls at the Mishkova River. Soviet reinforcements, transferred from other sectors with a speed the Germans do not anticipate, stop the relief column and begin pushing it back. The 48 kilometers between Hoth and the pocket does not close further. It will never close. The aircraft arrive in groups, when they arrive at all. Heinkel He, 111s and Junkers. Ju-52s cross the steppe at altitude, descending toward the airfields inside the pocket. Primarily Pitomnik, the largest and most functional strip the Sixth Army controls. Ground crews work in temperatures that drop to -30 Celsius. Engines freeze overnight if not kept running. Wounded men are loaded for the return flight, often packed into fuselages not designed for passengers, some dying before the aircraft reaches safe altitude. The planes that land, unload and depart do so under Soviet artillery fire that grows more accurate as the weeks pass. What they carry is never enough. The daily delivery figures tell the story without ambiguity. In the first weeks of the airlift, average daily tonnage delivered into the pocket reaches approximately 94 tons. Against a minimum survival requirement of 500 tons, this means the army is receiving less than 1/5 of what it needs to maintain any kind of sustained defensive capacity. Fuel deliveries fall so short that vehicle movement inside the pocket is progressively restricted. Tanks that cannot be moved are used as static firing positions. Artillery ammunition is rationed so tightly that batteries are assigned fixed daily limits regardless of the tactical situation on a given day. Food is the most immediate pressure. By mid-December, the daily bread ration for soldiers inside the pocket has fallen to roughly 200 grams, about the weight of 2 small bread rolls. Combat troops receive slightly more than rear area personnel, but the margin is narrow. The army begins slaughtering horses for food, first the animals no longer needed for transport, then progressively those still serving operational functions. A Sixth Army report from late December estimates that over 30,000 horses have been killed for consumption. Officers record in private correspondence what official dispatches do not transmit clearly, that men are growing too weak to perform basic duties, that frostbite cases are overwhelming the medical stations, and that the wounded lying in aid stations cannot be evacuated fast enough to make room for new casualties. General Paulus reports the deteriorating situation through official channels with increasing urgency. His December dispatches to Army Group Don describe an army that is losing its capacity to fight, not from enemy assault, but from the cumulative arithmetic of insufficient supply. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Don and responsible for the relief effort, reads these reports and understands their implication. He attempts to secure authorization for a coordinated breakout while Hoth's column is still within range. Hitler refuses to authorize it. Manstein, operating within the same chain of command that constrains Paulus, does not override the decision. The Luftwaffe's failure is not purely a failure of effort. Crews fly in conditions that ground most air operations. Aircraft are lost to Soviet fighters, to anti-aircraft fire, and to the weather itself. But the fundamental problem is structural. The transport fleet available for the airlift never comes close to the capacity required. Göring's November promise had been built on an assessment of what the Luftwaffe might theoretically deliver under favorable conditions, not on what it could realistically sustain over weeks of winter operations at extended range against a strengthening Soviet air defense. The promise once made became the premise on which the entire fortress strategy rested. Revising it would have required admitting that the strategy itself was unworkable. That admission does not come. On January 8, 1943, Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky delivers a formal ultimatum to the Sixth Army. The terms offer safe passage for all soldiers, medical care for the wounded, the right to retain personal belongings, and repatriation after the war. Paulus, acting on Hitler's explicit instructions, refuses. His response cites his duty as a soldier and the expectation of relief. A relief operation that has by this point been pushed back to a distance from which it cannot plausibly reach the pocket. The men inside the perimeter are not informed of the ultimatum or its refusal. The airlift continues. The daily figures do not improve, and the army that was told to hold until relief arrived is now holding in conditions that relief can no longer change. At 8:05 in the morning on January 10, 1943, Soviet artillery opens along the western perimeter of the Stalingrad pocket. The barrage involves over 7,000 guns and mortars firing simultaneously across a front that the Sixth Army no longer has the reserves to defend in depth. Operation Koltso, Ring, has begun. It is not a probing attack or a localized assault. It is a systematic compression designed to reduce the pocket methodically from the outside in, collapsing the perimeter at a rate faster than German forces can redeploy to meet each new breach. The Sixth Army that faces this assault is not the force that crossed the Don 7 months earlier. By January, malnutrition has visibly degraded the physical capacity of most soldiers inside the pocket. Medical records from Pitomnik airfield document men arriving at the evacuation point unable to walk unassisted, their weight reduced to the point where standard uniform sizes no longer fit. Frostbite has taken fingers, toes, and in some cases the capacity to operate weapons effectively. Units that appear on the order of battle as divisions are functioning at the strength of battalions. The defensive line holds not because it is strong, but because the men holding it have nowhere to go and no order authorizing them to move. Pitomnik falls on January 16th. It is the loss that makes everything else unavoidable. Pitomnik has been the primary airfield through which supplies entered the pocket and wounded men departed. With it gone, the airlift, already delivering a fraction of what was needed, is reduced further still. A secondary strip at Gumrak continues operations briefly, but it cannot compensate for the capacity lost. Wounded men who would have been evacuated now remain inside the shrinking perimeter. Supplies that might have extended resistance by days no longer arrive in meaningful quantity. Paulus transmits reports to Army Group headquarters describing the situation with clinical precision, even as the language begins to carry an undercurrent of finality. On January 20th, he signals that the Army's combat effectiveness is approaching exhaustion, that ammunition for certain calibers is effectively spent, and that the wounded inside the pocket now number in the tens of thousands with no means of evacuation. He does not request permission to surrender. He continues to operate within the framework of his orders. Gumrak falls on January 22nd. The last functioning airstrip inside the pocket is gone. The airlift ends not by decision, but by the elimination of any surface on which aircraft can land. From this point forward, nothing enters the pocket and nothing leaves it. The southern portion of the pocket is cut off from the northern section on January 26, when Soviet forces reach the Mamayev-Kurgan area and split the remaining German position in two. Paulus and his headquarters are now confined to the basement of the Univermag department store in central Stalingrad, a location that has become the de facto command center as successive headquarters positions have been overrun or abandoned. Around him, the city that the Sixth Army fought for months to capture has become the geography of its destruction. On January 30th, Hitler promotes Paulus to General Feldmarschall, Field Marshal. The message accompanying the promotion notes, without subtlety, that no German field marshal has ever been taken prisoner. The implication is understood. Paulus does not act on it. On January 31st, Soviet forces reach the Univermag building. Paulus surrenders. He is 52 years old, physically deteriorated, and has not slept in any consistent sense for weeks. He is the first German field marshal to be captured alive in the Second World War. His surrender does not end the battle. The northern pocket, commanded by General Karl Strecker, continues resistance for 2 more days. On February 2, 1943, Strecker transmits his final signal to Army Group headquarters. It reads, in part, that the Sixth Army has held to the last in accordance with its orders. Then the signal stops. The Battle of Stalingrad is over. It has lasted from August 1942 to February 2, 1943, 162 days inside the city, the final 73 of them inside a shrinking ring from which there was no authorized exit and, by the end, no physical one either. The columns begin moving on February 2, 1943, and for days afterward, long lines of men crossing frozen ground in temperatures that have not risen above -20 for weeks. They move west and north, away from the ruins of the city, guarded by Soviet soldiers who are themselves exhausted and undersupplied. Many of the German prisoners cannot walk without support. Some collapse within the first kilometers and do not rise. The conditions of captivity in the immediate aftermath of the surrender are extreme. Food is scarce, shelter is inadequate, and the Soviet logistical system, strained by months of offensive operations, is not prepared to process prisoners at this scale. In the weeks following the surrender, thousands of men who survived the pocket die in transit camps and holding areas before any formal processing begins. Of the approximately 91,000 men who enter Soviet captivity at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 will return to Germany. The last survivors are repatriated in 1955, 12 years after the surrender, 10 years after the war itself ends. For most families in Germany, the fate of a father, son, or husband captured at Stalingrad remains officially unresolved for years, sometimes decades. The word Stalingrad becomes, in German memory, a name that functions less as a place than as a condition, an absence that does not resolve cleanly into either death or survival. The strategic consequences arrive faster than the human ones can be counted. Within weeks of the surrender, Germany's allied governments, Romania, Hungary, Italy, begin reassessing the terms of their participation in the Eastern War. Their armies have suffered catastrophic losses on the flanks of the Stalingrad salient, the precise flanks whose weakness made the Soviet encirclement possible. The confidence that had held the coalition together, the belief that German operational dominance would eventually produce a decisive result, has been visibly broken. Italy begins quiet diplomatic exploration of alternatives. Hungary recalibrates its commitment. The political architecture of the Axis, never as solid as Berlin assumed, begins a slow structural deterioration from which it does not recover. Inside Germany, the public learns of the defeat through a carefully managed announcement on February 3, 1943. 3 days of national mourning are declared. But the information available to ordinary Germans is incomplete. Casualty figures are not published in full, the scale of the prisoner column is not described, and the circumstances of the surrender are presented in terms of heroic sacrifice rather than strategic failure. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels repurposes the defeat as evidence of German willingness to fight to the last. The gap between what the regime communicates and what soldiers' families privately understand widens in ways the government cannot fully control. For those inside the Wehrmacht who understand what Stalingrad reveals, the operational lessons are clear and alarming. The assumptions that made the encirclement possible, that Allied armies could hold extended flanks, that air supply could substitute for ground logistics at scale, that will and doctrine could override material reality, are not discarded after February 1943. They persist. The same patterns of optimistic logistical assessment, the same reluctance to authorize tactical withdrawal under pressure, the same tendency to hold positions beyond the point of operational utility, appear repeatedly in German planning through 1943 and into 1944. Stalingrad does not teach the Wehrmacht what it needs to learn quickly enough to matter. General Paulus, in Soviet captivity, eventually joins the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization through which captured officers broadcast appeals to German troops. His participation is used effectively by Soviet propaganda and generates bitter condemnation from Hitler, who regards it as the final confirmation of a betrayal he had anticipated since the surrender. Paulus returns to East Germany in 1953. He dies in Dresden in 1957, 14 years after walking out of the Univermag basement, never having fully reconciled the orders he followed with the consequences they produced. The city of Stalingrad is renamed Volgograd in 1961. On the Mamayev-Kurgan hill, the high ground that both sides fought over repeatedly during the battle, the terrain feature whose control shaped the entire urban struggle, a memorial complex is completed in 1967. At its center stands an 85-meter concrete statue, one of the largest in the world, a figure with a raised sword facing west. The hill contains the remains of an estimated 35,000 soldiers. The exact number has never been determined.